Welcome to the Compliance Perspectives Podcast. I'm Adam Turtletop from the Society of Corporate Compliance and Ethics and Healthcare Compliance Association. Joining me today from the Bay Area, Northern California, is Amii Barnard-Bahn. Amii is an executive coach and leadership consultant with a deep background in HR and compliance, having served in one of her many roles as the Chief Compliance and Ethics Officer for U.S. Pharmaceuticals for McKesson. Amii, thanks for taking the time to talk to us today.
Happy to. Thanks, Adam.
So, as I mentioned, you worked in both HR and compliance. What does compliance typically not get about HR?
Well, I'd say the first thing that we don't get sometimes is how much alike we are. Like compliance, HR often struggles to have a seat at the table. They may not have the resources to fulfill their mandate, and they often are challenged to get leadership to do the right thing. So I find, having gone back and forth, that we really should have tremendous empathy for each other, and that foundation of empathy gives lead to trust, which is the key to all relationships. I kind of feel like we both are the unsung heroes of the organization in terms of, protecting corporate reputation. But getting back to your original question, what compliance really doesn't get about HR, I think sometimes, is that compliance is only a part of what HR does. And HR's mandate is a lot broader. So if you're working with HR, if you only focus on compliance and what could go wrong, that could be viewed as myopic in the HR world. HR's got a mandate to support the culture that attracts the best and the brightest. We've got a mandate to support culture that encourages ethical conduct and compliance with the law. And these two things are not incompatible, but we really start from different places.
Yeah, and what's funny is as you're mentioning that, it's interesting that something that resonates in my career is that I think back when I worked at an advertising agency, talking to a client one day who said, "Look, Adam, I appreciate all the effort you put into the advertising, but it's only 10% of what I do with my time. So
Yeah,
I can't think
yeah.
that way." And I think it's a good thing to always remember that just because we have a lot in common doesn't mean we also have other things we got to get to. So, what does HR typically not get about compliance?
Well, depending on the organization, I think, I've been in organizations where HR really fails to appreciate the importance of compliance and how that relates to their work and what they can get done if there's a problem. So sometimes what I think they don't get is that a major compliance breach will negatively impact reputation, which damages HR's recruitment efforts and retention of the best and brightest, and that money for fines, is going to be paid out instead of bonuses, and that it can lead to restructuring and organizational design impact. And I think of compliance and HR, having been in both worlds, I find that they're almost like two different cultures with two different languages, but with an overlapping mandate. And I also find, broadly speaking, that HR and compliance tend to attract two different kinds of people. I've hired and recruited for both types of teams, and HR business partners specifically tend to really value a connection with people, and they often have gone into the profession to help others. And so making a personal connection is the top value, and they often tend to be feeling people on the Myers-Briggs scale, if you're familiar with that. And then compliance people, again, just generalizing, not everyone's like this, but in general, compliance people tend to value knowledge, what's right, what's accurate. They value technical skill and expertise, sometimes above relationships, and we tend to be thinkers on the Myers-Briggs scale. And when you think of those values drive everything we do. So if functionally HR and compliance generally have different values, this can really lead to value judgments that we make that can create, kind of a seemingly impenetrable wall. So each side from their vantage point authentically says of the other, I'm sure this has happened to you, they just don't get what's important here.
Yeah, that's often a problem where people just think different ways. What do you find is most successful in clearing up the confusion and helping the team work together, other than recognizing sort of these thinking, feeling differences?
There's a great quote by Teddy Roosevelt: "Nobody cares how much you know until they know how much you care."
Hmm.
And I think that HR and compliance need to have each other's back. They're much stronger together. Things you can do is, number one, get clear on your common ground, how much you have in common. what the goals and objectives are, which really putting it at a 50,000-foot level is to have a healthy workplace. And then number 2 is investing in the relationship. We've talked about that throughout this conversation, but really getting to know HR as a business like you would any client. Know their business cycles, understand their employee life cycle touch points, know their goals, mandates, and their struggles. And that enables you to then align your goals with theirs. And then you can understand their challenges. So when you ask for something, you really need to understand the cost and pain point of what you're asking them to do and how that fits into their work. And you're much likelier to get to yes, and an enthusiastic yes, if you've conveyed that you get their world and you know the cost and impact of what you're asking. And then the other thing is to have their back. HR really needs support, probably more than compliance thinks. There's one study that was slightly alarming, actually. It showed that 1 in 5 HR people would not report misconduct and felt ethical pressure to compromise their organization's ethical standards, policy, or the law. And, having been in HR, I've been there. HR knows really where the skeletons are buried. They really know how the company works, how management decisions are made. They're often in the room where it happens. And I think of them as HR as the canary in the coal mine of organizational risk, if you will. And what does that say about the effectiveness of our compliance programs if HR, who's boots on the ground with this type of stuff, doesn't feel comfortable coming forward if there's an issue? So I think it's important to really extend some support there as well.
Yeah, I think that it was definitely one of those things where it does send off a little bit of alarm bells that even HR feels hesitant to come forward with these issues. And, your advice about understanding their role and responsibility is, I think, really a good one. I mean, we talk a lot in compliance about getting to understand the business, but by the same token, there's other parts of the organization that compliance depends on, like HR, but also internal audit, legal, fraud, that spending some time better understanding their goals would be probably quite helpful for the compliance team. Now, one other issue that sometimes comes up is the challenge of tracking HR issues that come in via the helpline. I mean, oftentimes, maybe most time these days, compliance is in charge of the helpline. You get the calls in that are basically, my boss and I aren't getting along, or an issue like sexual harassment, which may be handled by HR instead of compliance. Bottom line is it's something that HR needs to deal with, but compliance wants to track and make sure the issue gets handled so that the caller will feel comfortable coming forward when there's an actual compliance issue. And also you want people to be able to say, hey, when I called the helpline, I actually got a response and people followed up. How can compliance help HR understand this dynamic of really responding to these calls and getting back to compliance of what happened?
Yeah, I think starting at the top with, look, we want a healthy workplace. We have that as a common goal. So we want people to feel comfortable coming forward. And I think if you set a common vision and gain alignment with HR around that, then you can also, set as a behavior standard that you've got to ensure that issues are handled promptly, thoroughly, and fairly, consistently to meet the compliance mandate and to engender trust throughout the organization for HR standpoint. So if you do that, then I think there's just some infrastructure stuff that needs to be put in place, like a RACI chart is often what I've worked on with HR and compliance in my organizations, where it's really clear, you do an inventory of every type of issue that could come in, including those kind of low-lying interpersonal stuff that doesn't rise to a compliance challenge, but it could be when you dig deeper. Right? Mm-hmm. Sometimes people just don't know the magic words to say to articulate it, or they're testing it out, they're not sure, and that's why as compliance professionals, I think it's so important to educate HR about that. But if you know who's on first, who's got it, and then you have a standard of behavior around how they should be handled and why, and that's documented, I think that can be important. I do think there's a certain amount of recruitment, Adam, that needs to go on. You need to kind of recruit HR to the common goal. HR can get really fatigued. Speaking from personal experience, HR is on the front lines on every employee issue possible. And fully a third to a half that come in on a really open door helpline are not compliance issues. And so HR has to fight a natural urge to become numb to some of this, in case one day a real compliance issue arises involving those employees. So I think there is a certain amount of that. So if you can keep that ultimate goal in mind, and to remind HR that, I think of employee relations issues are the broken windows kind of compliance. And so if we don't handle the low-lying issues well, it can be a gateway to much more serious compliance issues. And so if you can make that connection for HR, find the least cumbersome way to partner with them on this, stay out of the weeds. You can't make it about sounding like you're telling HR how to do their job. So I think you have to keep it at a very high level with goals and tangible kind of customer service objectives, and then it can keep it clear.
Yeah, it's definitely, nobody likes to be told how to do their job. It's good advice for everything in life, in all of our interactions. Now, we've talked a lot about what compliance and HR have in common, how they need to work together. But sort of the flip side to that is there's always the risk of turf battles. This is my issue. No, it's not. It's my issue. How can compliance best avoid turf battles with HR?
I think the first thing is to have a clear roles and responsibilities knocked out. I would literally, in my teams, I've literally sat down and just whiteboarded, hey, this is what my mandate is, what's yours, and then just knocked through. Because then you kind of get a Venn diagram. My goal is to always have a Venn diagram of, okay, what's mine, what's yours, where do we overlap, so that it's very clear ahead of time before there's a problem where there could be concerns around ownership or who has the role for what. So if you do that ahead of time, that proactive management in a spirit of shared goals, I think that's really helpful. And then really building a strong relationship with the person, like any good marriage, it requires work from the heart and staying in touch with them so that you have that foundation. So when a turf battle arises, you've already built trust and candor to work through that issue in a healthy way. Again, those shared aspirational goals are really important. I think that oftentimes when we can't figure out why someone doesn't support us, it's because we're not able to see it from their perspective. There is always, if someone's fighting you on an issue, there's always a hidden competing concern that they have that they legitimately, authentically feel is more important. And so if you have the trust and a candid relationship to be able to talk to that person or figure it out, then you have something, then aha, okay, this is what's blocking them. This is what they're interested in. Then you can talk about it. But it's amazing how hidden some of these are. And sometimes people don't even know why they're blocking something until you can talk about it. So creating kind of a psychological safety zone to talk about those issues, surface them and work on them can be a really great way once you do get into a turf battle. And of course, those are just a part of life.
Right. And I think, you made a lot of good points there, including the just ongoing importance of something I remember learning years ago, which is always talk from the listener's perspective, not from yours. Think about what they want to hear, what they're going to respond to, not just what you need to say. Well, Amii, thank you so much for sharing your thoughts and talking from the perspective of compliance officers and giving them the perspective of HR folks too. Thanks to all of you for taking the time to listen to this podcast. I'm Adam Turtletop from SCCE and HCCA, saying I hope we were able to expand your compliance perspective.